Garrett Wilson is the number one option for the Jets in the passing game. Don't be surprised if options 2 and 3 are both rookies. We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm John B. from GanggreenNation.com, and today's episode is brought to you by Odoo. Great organizations win because operations matter, and that's why you should get Odoo. Try for free today at odoo.com/lockedon. That's odoo.com/lockedon. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the 3 biggest questions facing the Jets at wide receiver and tight end. We'll talk about whether role players can step up and perhaps claim bigger roles. We'll discuss whether the Jets may lean into a new personnel grouping that could give them an advantage on offense. But we'll start by talking about the direct supporting cast behind Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson is slated to be the Jets' number 1 receiver this year, as he has been essentially since the team drafted him back in 2022. He's been in the NFL 4 years. In 3 of them, he's posted 1,000 yards or more receiving. And the only year he did not was last year, where he missed half the season with injury. And at the point he got injured, he was on pace for another 1,000-yard season. We don't have to worry much about Garrett Wilson. We know he's about as sure a thing as you can have at the wide receiver position, as long as he stays healthy. And he was able to stay healthy those first 3 years. Last year, he was banged up a bit. It was a nightmare season for the Jets on many levels, but we can expect Garrett to come back and be more than solid. He's a legitimate number 1 receiver in this league. And it's nice to be starting from that point. So often through the history of this podcast, and we've been doing this for 10 years now, before Garrett Wilson arrived, every year it felt like we had to talk ourselves into some really physically gifted player who would step up as the number 1 receiver. It's nice to have somebody, as long as he stays healthy, he's very likely to go for 1,000 to 1,100 yards. And that's what Garrett Wilson is. The question for the Jets is, who fills in behind Garrett Wilson? Who's going to be the number 2 guy? Who's going to be the number 3 guy? And for far too often in Garrett Wilson's career, there really hasn't been a second option or a third option. I think the only time the Jets really had a viable number 2 guy was that 3/4 of a season after they traded for Devontae Adams. And even then there were so many complications because the point the Jets made the trade, really the deal was not very logical. The Jets were pretty much finished at the point they traded for Adams. They rented him for 3/4 of a season. And Adams and Aaron Rodgers had that pre-existing relationship, and Rodgers was force feeding Adams the ball even when he wasn't open. And it came at Garrett Wilson's expense. So even the one time Garrett Wilson's had a quality number 2 guy behind him, it really wasn't an ideal situation. The Jets are hoping things will change this year. And it's not clear exactly who the number 2 guy is going to be. There are some candidates. There are even some off-the-radar candidates who we're going to discuss a little bit later. But I think at this point, the smart money would suggest that it's going to be one of the 2 guys they just drafted in the first round. I mean, I don't think that's a controversial statement. When you draft 2 pass catchers in the first round, I think you're expecting both of them to play a pretty prominent role on your team. And both Omar Cooper and Kenyon Sadiq, they're going to be instant starters. I think as long as they stay healthy through training camp and the exhibition season, you'll see them in the starting lineup week 1 because there aren't really many other options behind them. And when you draft 2 guys in the first round, again, you're expecting them to play big roles. So I think that Cooper and Sadiq will be your second and third options. The question is, who's number 2 and who's number 3? And I think the answer for 2026 could be different from the answer long-term. Let me explain why I say that. I think of the 2, Cooper's probably more ready to produce in the NFL, but Sadiq has the bigger potential. Sadiq's, first of all, coming into the league in a position that's difficult to transition. Tight end's more complicated to move from college to the NFL than wide receiver. And you might wonder why I say that. The answer is actually pretty simple, though. Think of it this way. A tight end pretty much has to do everything a wide receiver does. Sadiq's got to learn the routes running that you run from the outside. He's got to learn the routes you run from the slot. That's what stuff wide receivers do. But he's also got to learn how to block. He's got to, or maybe he knows how to block, but he's got to refine his blocking. He's got to play inline. He's got to play at the H-back position. He's got to learn how to run routes from both spots. There's more to learn from the tight end position than there is the wide receiver position. At tight end, you're learning everything a wide receiver learns and then more because you have more roles. You got to block, unlike wide receivers. You got more spots you can line up pre-snap. You got more spots you can run routes from. You got a bigger route tree typically. So it's a bigger transition. And I think that if we're being honest, Sadiq is kind of a project. that doesn't mean he can't be successful. It just means he's got a little bit further to go than most guys do. And I think if you look at like the 2-year track record of Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji, there's always a degree coaching staff in a front office lean towards production versus traits. And it's always a combination of the two. You're always drafting some guys who you think have good traits, other guys who have good production. In an ideal world, you have both. I think generally speaking, the Jets have leaned more towards production during the 2-year Glenn Muji era. Sadiq's kind of an outlier. And that tells me that they really like him, because when you kind of lean against your type, when you lean against your own preferences in the draft, that tells me that like you believe that this guy's an exceptional prospect. And another thing that tells me that they really are high on Sadiq beyond the obvious that they drafted him high in the first round is they kept everything a secret. Heading into the draft, there was so much buzz that the Jets liked David Bailey over Arvell Reese, and they picked Bailey number 2 overall. There was so much buzz that the Jets loved Cooper. There was a lot of talk about him potentially going 16th overall. They had, of course, ended up picking him 30th. Nobody knew the Jets were drafting Sadiq. Sadiq didn't even know it. Sadiq, if you go back and read what Sadiq said to the media after the draft, he said, I had no idea the Jets were interested in me. They really kept that under wraps. So that tells you they wanted nobody to know that they were into Sadiq. They didn't care about David Bailey, and they really shouldn't have, because they had their choice of Bailey or Reese. We knew Fernando Mendoza was going to go number 1 overall, which meant the Jets had the choice of all the non-Mendoza prospects. So it really didn't matter whether they made it publicly known that they liked Bailey. They did kind of let it be known that they liked Cooper. But Sadiq was kind of a surprise. And again, like that means long-term they like Sadiq, and it's easy to understand why. With his physical tools, he is a guy who could potentially dominate in this league, but it's going to take some time. And they're just basic nuanced things he's got to learn. There are some really subtle things with route running. I think one of the big things with Sadiq that I see is he's got to learn how to use tempo in his routes. It's great to be the fastest guy on the field, but much like baseball, where if you have a guy who throws 100 miles an hour, you're not going to be effective throwing 100 every pitch, because eventually like hitters will be able to time you. You got to be able to change speeds. And when you can throw an off-speed pitch or a breaking ball that's like 15 to 20 miles slower, it makes that fastball even more effective, that 100-mile-an-hour heater more effective when you go to it, because suddenly the hitter might be used to something slower. Now you're throwing something past him. And with Sadiq, if you go slow, then zoom past the guy, it's going to be more effective than just going straight, high at your top speed right off the snap. I think Cooper's a little bit more refined. I think Cooper's a guy whose game could translate to a more immediate impact in the NFL, because he's especially good after the catch. And I think he'll see a fair share of time in the slot. I think he and Wilson will kind of split the slot, and you'll see other guys slide in there. I'm sure Sadiq will spend some time in the slot, but I think Cooper, especially as a rookie, because one of the big strengths of his game is making plays after the catch with the ball in his hands. I think you'll see him catch a lot of short passes out of the slot. And I think that makes him more likely to be the number 2 guy. Sadiq, I think the physical tools give him a floor, I think. And he's a guy who very easily could be the 3rd option in the offense year 1. And then as he gets his feet wet, as he gets more NFL experience, you can see him take on a bigger role, maybe become the number 2 option, maybe even the number 1 option in year 2, year 3. But it's nice to have like other guys with potential on this offense, because much like I was talking about earlier, through the early years of this podcast, we kept trying to talk ourselves into somebody who could step up as the Jets' number 1 receiver. Then we got Garrett Wilson, who actually is the number 1 receiver. So we spent the last couple of years trying to talk ourselves into guys who could be the number 2 receiver. I mean, this time last year, we were trying to talk ourselves into Arian Smith as the number 2 receiver. Then we got 2 guys with legitimate first-round pedigrees, 2 guys with legitimate tools who could be the main supporting cast behind Garrett Wilson in Omar, Cooper, and Kenyon Sadiq. And that's a good thing for the Jets. Neither is proven, of course. Neither has taken their first snap in the NFL. Way too early to write either in pen as a great sidekick to Garrett Wilson. But you've got guys who potentially could be really effective in their roles. And that means, first of all, Garrett doesn't have to be the primary target on every play. There are plays where you can give Garrett a little bit of a rest, where you just tell him you're the decoy, and that'll probably make him better. It'll also make it tougher to slide coverage towards Garrett's direction, less coverage rolling his way, less double teams, because you actually have guys who might be able to make the defense pay. And again, this is the sort of thing that the Jets will benefit from this year, but also in the long run, because Geno Smith's not going to be the long-term quarterback for this team. The Jets are gearing up for a young quarterback to take over perhaps as early as 2027. who's going to be the number 2, who's going to be the number 3. My guess is that Cooper probably starts as the number 2, Sadiq starts as the number 3, but it could change. Maybe Sadiq's a quick learner, and we can certainly hope that because he's got all the potential in the world. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're not done talking about Sadiq. He opens up some interesting personnel packages for the Jets that could give them an advantage over their opponents when they take the field on offense. We'll discuss it as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Odoo. Running a business should not feel like you're trying to connect a bunch of systems that were never designed to work together. One app for accounting, another for inventory, another for sales, and somehow none of them talk to each other. That's where Odoo comes in. Odoo is an all-in-one business management software that brings every part of your business together in one powerful platform. From sales and accounting to inventory and marketing, everything works in one place, helping your team move faster, stay organized, and focus on growing the business instead of managing software. The best organizations know that success is not just about talent. It's about having everyone work towards the same goal. And that's true in sports just like it is in business. I mean, you could talk about the Jets, 4 picks in the top 50 of the NFL draft, but they weren't just looking for the biggest names. They weren't looking for the most talented guys only. They wanted guys who are going to buy into what Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji are building, hard workers. You could tell it was not a reactionary move. The organization had a vision, stuck to it, and now you'll see the results because everyone was working from the same playbook. Great organizations win because operations matter. And that's why you should get Odoo. Try for free today at odoo.com/lockedon. That's odoo.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. A big shout out to you everydayers. Get your daily Jets fix completely ad-free by joining the Everydayer Club today. Start your 7-day free trial right now and get closer to your team without the interruptions. Click the link in the show notes or go to lockedonnyjets.supercast.com to claim your free trial. On today's episode, we're talking about the biggest questions the Jets face at the wide receiver and tight end positions. These are the main pass catchers on a football team. And I think in the modern NFL, the distinction between wide receivers and tight ends has kind of blurred. There was a time decades ago where they had 2 distinct roles. Your tight end was mainly a blocker, and then occasionally he'd go out on routes, and your wide receivers were mainly focused on catching the football. But with the rise of modern offenses, tight end has mainly become a pass-catching position. You still have some guys who are blocking specialists. You still have some guys who are do-it-all types who are able to do both. But the great tight ends in this league are known for their pass-catching skills. I mean, if you don't agree with that, just think about who you think the best tight ends in the NFL are. And let me ask you, are they good pass catchers? The answer is absolutely. Now, some of them are also really good blockers. I'm not saying blocking is irrelevant, but I'm saying that I think that the distinctions between these positions has never been smaller. And I think that it creates interesting opportunities for a team like the Jets because over the last 2 years, the Jets have drafted 2 tight ends in the top 2 rounds. A year ago, it was Mason Taylor going in the 2nd round out of LSU. This year, of course, it was Kenyon Sadiq in the 1st round out of Oregon. And we still do have Jeremy Ruckert on this team, although I'm not really clear on what his role is going to be. The Jets coaching staff seems to like him. I mean, they gave him a contract extension near the end of last season. Now he's kind of relegated to being a very expensive number 3 tight end. He's a depth guy. And I was talking a little bit earlier this week about the possibility of maybe he moves to fullback or something. You know, that certainly could be on the table. But I think that as you watch the league evolve, there are interesting things you notice. Like you see offenses react to defense, and then defenses react to offense, and then offenses react to the defense's reaction. And watching NFL schemes over the last couple of years, you're starting to see more and more 2 tight end sets. And I think that the 2 tight end set will be a staple of the Jets offense going forward with Sadiq and Taylor on the team. Now, the primary personnel grouping in the NFL, and I'm sure that it will be the Jets' primary personnel grouping, remains 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 wide receivers. And that's something that's risen over the last 15, 20 years or so. You used to have 2 backs. You used to have a regular running back and a fullback, then a tight end, then 2 receivers. And the fullback's kind of been phased out of the NFL. Again, not completely. There still are some teams like Baltimore and San Francisco that use the fullback extensively, but the fullback's kind of become a part-time player in a way he wasn't in the past. You know, again, you go back 30 years, the fullback was a full-time staple of an offense, but the offenses have evolved. And the dominant personnel grouping is the 3 receiver set. And that's led defenses to get smaller. Now, your typical defense base is a nickel. 5 defensive backs. In the past, it was you either ran a 4-3 defense, 4 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, or a 3-4 defense, 3 defensive linemen and 4 linebackers. Things have changed with the rise of the 3 receiver set because you need as many corners on the field typically as the other team has receivers. In the past, you could play a 4-3 or a 3-4 because 2 receivers required 2 corners. Now with 3 receivers on the field, you need 3 corners. So 3 corners, 2 safeties, 5 defensive backs. It's called a nickel. And defenses have gotten smaller as a result because typically a linebacker comes off the field and that 5th defensive back, that 3rd corner comes on the field. So what I'm trying to get at here is defenses have gotten smaller because offenses have gotten smaller. Well, over the last couple of years, we've kind of seen a trend in the league of offenses kind of getting bigger again. They're starting to see offenses run more 2 tight end sets. And one of the interesting things is watching when you watch the league evolve is how they kind of put new twists on old strategies. Because in many ways, like the fullback and tight end positions are similar. They both historically have been primarily blocking positions. But going back to what I said a little bit earlier, tight end has kind of evolved itself. It's become more of a pass catching position. Bigger guys, though, they're essentially like big wide receivers. So now we're going back to like these big lineups where you only have 2 receivers on the field and you have 2 tight ends and 1 running back. And it's going to force defenses to evolve. And if you have 2 dynamic pass catching tight ends, it's the sort of thing that can put defenses into a real questionable situation, particularly a guy like Kenyon Sadiq. I think the idea behind drafting Sadiq is that he has the potential to be a matchup nightmare. He's the sort of guy, it's the old cliche about tight ends, but it's true when you have a great one, the guy who's too big for corners to cover and too fast for linebackers and safeties to cover, a guy who is built like a linebacker but runs like a wide receiver. And it puts the defense into a tough spot personnel-wise. And it's the sort of thing that can help clarify a lot for a quarterback, because if you think that like your linebackers and safeties can't cover Sadiq, well, you're probably going to stick with three corners on the field. You may just put a corner on Sadiq. But if it's an early down where the run's still on the table, now it's a little bit different on 3rd and long, but like on 1st and 2nd down, if you say, you know what, our linebackers and safeties can't cover Sadiq, we got to have a corner on the field. Well, you put yourself at a disadvantage because essentially your defense is small, the offense is big. So the quarterback can just check to a run and just say, we're going to run the ball. You can make an audible. And then Sadiq's going to block a corner. So life is really easy. On the other side, if you decide to put linebacker or safety on Sadiq, well, if he's too fast for them, well, it's going to be an easy throw for the quarterback. When you have tight ends who can make plays in the passing game, it really, really opens up a lot. And I think Sadiq can also be kind of a movable chess piece for the Jets. We talked a little bit earlier about how he's got to learn so much. He's got to learn the tight end spots. He's got to learn how to block, how to play inline, how to play at the H-back. He might even line up in the backfield from time to time, but he's also got to learn the wide receiver spots. He'll play in the slot. He'll play tight slot. He'll move all the way to the outside. Well, moving Sadiq around can be an indicator for a quarterback pre-snap. And the reason I say that is, let's just talk about hypothetically when you move a tight end out wide. Well, if a linebacker follows him out wide and Sadiq's like lined up where wide receivers typically lined up and a linebacker follows him out there, well, that's a pretty big indicator that the defense is in man-to-man coverage, because why else would you have a linebacker lined up where a corner typically is? So your quarterback essentially has a cheat code pre-snap, and you might be able to adjust the play to build in man-beating concepts. He also could just like the matchup. Linebackers don't like being all the way out wide. Linebackers aren't used to playing like corners, so it makes life a little bit easier. Whereas if Sadiq goes out wide and a corner follows him, and maybe you put Garrett Wilson in the slot for that play, and Garrett Wilson's like lined up over a linebacker, well, it's a pretty clear sign that it's zone coverage the defense is playing, because you would never put a linebacker one-on-one against Garrett Wilson. And, if your choice is one guy has to cover one linebacker has to cover a guy and one corner has to cover a guy, as dynamic as Sadiq may be, you're not going to put the linebacker on Garrett Wilson. You're going to put the corner on Garrett Wilson and the linebacker on Sadiq. So these are the sort of things that like you don't think about, but they make a big difference pre-snap. And when you go to 2 tight end sets, it creates bigger issues for the offense, because you create so many situations where you have flexibility. Normally if you're only playing 1 tight end, you kind of have to like tip your hand a little bit on offense because you're putting your tight end out wide. If you're putting your tight end out wide, you're probably not running the ball. Whereas with 2 tight ends, if you could stick Mason Taylor at the conventional tight end spot and put Sadiq out wide, and you still have Mason Taylor under the block, and Sadiq can kind of like tip the coverage on the offense. And if the quarterback thinks it's an advantageous situation to run, we can check it to run, and Mason Taylor is still there to block. So I think we're going to see a lot of 2 tight end sets out of the Jets this year. Now, I still think Jets will primarily be a 3 receiver set team because that's just the way the NFL works. But I bet you when we look at the ratios near the end of the year, the Jets will probably be among the league leaders in running multi tight end sets. And you may even work in some sets with 3 tight ends with Ruckert in there. I don't think he's going to get a ton of playing time. I think that, Ruckert's primarily going to come in and you'll primarily see 3 tight end sets on goal line short yardage situations because 3 tight end sets means Omar Cooper's off the field. I don't think the Jets want to do it that much. But the ability of the Jets to kind of mix and match their personnel groupings. They'll run the traditional 3 receiver set, but now they have the ability to put 2 tight end sets out there. And in addition to the potential matchup problems Sadiq can cause, it also just allows the quarterback to decipher so much pre-snap when you move a guy like that around and the defense is forced to respond. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, there's still some supporting players we have to discuss, including Mason Taylor. Taylor may not be the biggest piece of the Jets offense anymore after the drafting of Cooper and Sadiq, but he still will have a big role. So will Adonai Mitchell. So will a couple of other guys. We'll discuss continuing here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Support for today's episode comes from Square, the business platform helping sellers become neighborhood favorites. Whether you're preparing for a busy season or managing everyday demand, Square helps keep your business moving with everything from payments and online orders to inventory, staff management, and more all in one place. So business owners can spend less time managing tools and more time focusing on their customers. Square helps simplify the everyday work behind running a business while giving owners the tools they need to keep growing. And it's something you notice when you're supporting the local businesses that you love. It's really the little things, getting a digital receipt instantly, a smooth checkout, not waiting while someone tries to figure out a system. When a business has the right tools behind the scenes, the customer experience feels effortless. Square helps you run your business more smoothly, bringing payments, operations, and insights together in one place so you're ready for whatever's next. And right now, listeners can get up to $200 off Square hardware when you sign up at square.com/go/LockedOnNFL. That's SQUARE.com/go/LockedOnNFL. Get started with Square and build a setup that works the way you do. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're talking about some of the big questions that the Jets face at the wide receiver and tight end positions, the 2 pass catching positions in the NFL. We've talked about the question of who's going to be the number 2 guy behind Garrett Wilson. We've discussed whether the Jets may use the 2 tight end set to great effect this season, but I think any great pass catching group has depth. You have guys who don't necessarily produce big numbers, but they have important roles and they're reliable when called upon. And I think the Jets have a couple of guys who could potentially fill some important roles a little bit lower on the depth chart, namely Adonai Mitchell and Mason Taylor. Now, I know some of you may say, well, Adonai Mitchell and Mason Taylor are 2 guys likely to break out this year. And look, it would be great if they did. There's a lot that's unknown about this Jets pass catching group right now. So I wouldn't be shocked if Adonai Mitchell ended up having a bigger role than we're talking about right now, or Mason Taylor ended up having a bigger role than we're talking about right now. That's possible because you're dealing with a lot of guys with potential, but nobody who's really proven at this point after Garrett Wilson. So of course, it's possible that these guys take on bigger roles than we're discussing right now, but I'm just doing my best to make educated guesses. And my educated guess is that the 2 guys the Jets drafted in the first round are going to be the biggest players after Garrett. Of course, it's possible Mitchell and Taylor do take on fairly substantial roles themselves. And if they do, well, the Jets would be happy with that. But I think where we stand right now, Mitchell and Taylor both have important roles, and they're kind of like opposite roles. For Mitchell, I think his job is to kind of be the field stretcher. Now, Sadiq's got a lot of speed. Sadiq can work the middle of the field, especially in the seams, but the Jets have lacked a true deep threat, I think, really since Robbie Anderson left in free agency. Brashad Perryman ended up being a free agent bust in 2020. It never really happened for Denzel Mims. It never really happened for Elijah Moore. Garrett Wilson's great. Garrett Wilson's fantastic. Garrett Wilson's a legitimate number 1 receiver, but he's not a field stretcher. And I kind of like the way things are set up for Adonai Mitchell because you've got Omar Cooper, who can kind of be the slot guy who makes plays after the catch. You got Garrett Wilson, who can get open in the short game and in the intermediate game. Adonai Mitchell can be the field stretcher, and he can be the guy who can make you pay if you forget about him. He's the guy where if you're rolling coverage to Garrett Wilson, well, Mitchell's got the speed to beat another player one-on-one. And, he's potentially got the ability to grow into something more. I mean, I do think like he's started to come along a little bit as a route runner last year, and he's got the physical ability to play the X position at the wide receiver spot. So maybe he could be a little bit more, but I don't know if the Jets necessarily need him to be that much more because you've got those 2 first-round picks. What you really want is a complementary player who can be a legitimate deep threat in this offense. And if that's all Mitchell is, well, that might be enough for the Jets. And as far as Taylor goes, I know that there's been a lot of skepticism about his role going forward because when he was drafted, we all thought he was going to be the primary tight end of the future for the Jets. And in a world where Kenyon Sadiq was not available at 16, he very well may have been. Again, like, I don't think the Jets drafting Sadiq was a referendum on Taylor at all. I just think that they really love Sadiq. I think all of the evidence suggests that they thought Sadiq was a phenomenal prospect. And I think they would have been very happy going forward with Taylor as their number 1 tight end. Now, realistically, Taylor's role probably isn't what we thought it would be. He's probably not going to be the go-to tight end going forward. But as we discussed in the last segment, 2 tight end sets exist in the NFL. Just because you have a number 1 tight end doesn't mean that you're out of luck as the number 2 tight end. And I think that there's not a ton of overlap between the skill sets that Taylor and Sadiq have. Sadiq's really that like all-world athlete, the guy who's just incredible with the ball in his hands, incredible with his movement skills. He got the blazing speed. He's got the extreme athleticism. Whereas Taylor, to me, was always a guy who was going to be more of a refined player. It was a guy who, when he figured out his route running, he was going to be tough to cover on the short stuff. He was a guy who, even though he's big, and big guys typically take a while to change direction, he's very fluid in his movements. One of the things I talked a lot about after the drafted Taylor was I was really impressed by his change of direction ability because most big guys aren't as smooth, aren't as fluid, breaking left or breaking right as Taylor is. And I think that could be a real weapon for the Jets, particularly when I think about like third downs, when I think about 3rd and 6, 3rd and 5. You'll see a lot of Garrett Wilson in those situations, obviously. And I think Omar Cooper could be a guy who will be effective in those situations as well. But you want someone who's going to be able to create separation. And Mason Taylor was not a finished product when he was drafted by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, one of the things we talked about was there was raw ability for him to be a quality starting tight end, but there were some things that needed to be refined. And last year he got a lot of playing time. I think on most teams he probably would have played far less, but the Jets had so little at the tight end position, and the season was such a lost cause that they just decided to give the young guy as many reps as possible. And I think the hope is that in year 2, those reps will start to pay off. You'll start to see Taylor grow. You'll start to see him refine that route running and see him become a reliable option in that on those like 3rd and intermediates where you need we need someone you can go to. And I think that that's like the projected role for him. That's the ideal role for him at this point. He's not going to be a do-it-all tight end. That's not his game, and that's not really what the Jets are going to ask from him anymore. They want somebody who's just going to be that reliable target in those situations that I mentioned. So maybe it's possible Adonai Mitchell grows into something more. Maybe it's possible Mason Taylor grows into something more, and Taylor and Sadiq are like one part the tight end position. But that's a nice to have for the Jets. I don't think the Jets necessarily need that. I think the Jets are more looking for these guys to be reliable complementary players because, again, like any great receiving group, they have the top end talent. They have the Garrett Wilsons. They have the guys who are kind of the 2nd and 3rd bananas, but they also have like those reliable guys a little bit lower on the depth chart. And when the defense stops paying them attention on a key down, suddenly they make you pay, whether it's a deep ball to Adonai Mitchell or a shorter pass to Mason Taylor. And we can talk about some other guys too. I mean, on a show earlier this week, we talked about Jets running backs. And one of the things that I mentioned was there was a need to get Kene Nwangwu more involved in gadget plays and plays where there are manufactured touches in space because he's such an explosive return guy. And my belief is that when you got a good return guy, you try and draw up offensive plays that resemble a return, where they get the ball in space with blockers out in front of them. Isaiah Williams is another guy who's an excellent return guy. Guy had a phenomenal year last year after a nightmare start. Early in his Jets career, he got cut because he fumbled. He had a nightmare game in Miami week 4 on Monday Night Football. But earned his way back onto the roster from the practice squad and ended up being one of the best return guys in the NFL. So I think Williams has a role. I think Williams is the sort of guy where, Tanner Engstrand didn't do enough to get him the ball in space. That's hopefully something Frank Reich will fix. Hopefully with a more experienced offensive coordinator, you'll see Isaiah Williams get more involved. And while you can't say at this point that this Jets wide receiver group and tight end group are sure things, you can see the potential. You can see like how the pieces fit. You can see how the players complement each other with their skill sets. And this isn't like last year where we were trying to talk ourselves into a fourth-round rookie Arian Smith becoming a number 2 receiver. We're talking about like first-round picks settling into prominent roles with the team. We're talking about guys with defined skill sets taking on maybe complementary roles. We're talking about using our excellent return guy in space. These are the sorts of things that make sense. And these are the sorts of things that at least give this Jets team a fighting chance to move the ball through the air in 2026. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back next week to talk more Jets.